Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community. Start off by introducing yourself first.
Sure. My name is Andrea Kadlec, and I'm a staff attorney at Disability Rights Washington. And I've worked at Disability Rights Washington for 23 years, so kind of a long time. But I've always sort of been around disability. Most of the people in my family have disabilities, and I self-identify with disability. So, yeah, so it's that's how I came to this work, and that's why I do what I do.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about your work. If you can, let's dive into that. What's
Sure.
what do you what sorts of things do you focus on in the disability community?
So, in my time at Disability Rights Washington, I've worked on all kinds of things. So when I started, I was doing mostly training and community outreach and communications. My undergrad is in journalism, so I did a lot of and I worked on various projects. I've worked on several grants. So I was involved in Disability History Month in public education. We had about 90 students go down to Olympia to testify um, or meet with legislators in support of that legislation. We did a bunch of youth advocacy for several years. We had a big grant that did youth advocacy. We've done programs for everything from like Medicaid uh, programs that pay for out-of-pocket Medicare expenses and outreach around that to, um, communications around disability rights and disability, uh, the different types of litigation that we were working on. And what else have I done over the years? I've done a lot. So I worked at the DD Ombuds for a while too. So we'd go into residential facilities and make sure that people with disabilities had what they needed. And then in the last several years, I went to law school more recently. And in the last several years, I've been working as an attorney on education issues. And so my focus there has really been to reduce the use of restraint against students with disabilities and to eliminate the use of isolation against students with disabilities in schools. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what I've been working on for the last few decades,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
last couple decades.
Mm-hmm. If I if I could follow up, you talk about
Yeah.
your sort of like limiting restrictions on like isolation and stuff like that. So like what do you
Mhm.
mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in schools, if a student is at risk of immediate serious harm, imminent harm to themselves or others, teachers can do something that's called a restraint, or educational staff can do what's called a restraint, which is putting their arms around a student and uh, making it hard for the student to move, making the student immobile, right? So in that it's supposed to only be used for safety and in emergency situations. So I guess a couple of examples would be if you have an elementary student who's about to run in front of a bus, then you would want the teacher to restrain them, right? So they didn't hurt themselves. Um, I think the challenge that we see is that these practices aren't always used for emergency. Sometimes they're used for discipline, and they're used disproportionately against students with disabilities, students who are homeless in foster care, students who are low income, students who are uh, multiracial or Black. And so we're trying to address that. We're trying to reduce the use of restraint in schools. We know we need it sometimes for emergencies, but we had 25,000 restraints against 3,000 students in one school year. So that tells us that that's a lot. That's more than an emergency basis. And then isolation is a little bit different. Isolation is where you put a student in a very small locked cell, basically. They're usually closet size. They're built in mostly in special education classrooms. Usually a teacher has to engage a lock so that it locks. But some of them you are able to lock and walk away. And so that's a problem because the teacher or the staff is paraeducator or whoever's there, the adult who's there is supposed to stay with the student. So, um, but what we would like to do is to get rid of those rooms altogether because there's no educational or therapeutic benefit for them. And in fact, they cause a lot of long-term damage. They're very disabling for students. We've talked to students who have developed suicidal ideation after repeated isolation or have, adults who have PTSD from going through this experience in school. So it's very harmful and we'd like to eliminate the practice altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did not know that. If I could just like move on, like what sorts of are there like now that we're on this subject, because I'm really curious about it, like what kind of strategies, things of that nature, like can be used to like really make the student, part of the educational experience, while at the same time trying to dele do the delicate balance of like making sure that others around the student, are safe. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really the focus of this work is making sure that the supports are in place. We know that restraint and isolation happens to the students who've experienced the most trauma in school. So we're taking our most traumatized students and we're re-traumatizing them. So the idea is that if we put in supports early on, then we don't rely on restraint and isolation, and we can actually give students the supports they need so they don't escalate to crisis. So that's really the heart of this work is making sure students are included, that they are, feel welcomed and feel like they belong. They have the right accommodations in school. If they have an extensive trauma history, we want to make sure they have additional support for social emotional learning, self-regulation, maybe mental health, maybe more behavioral supports. There are all kinds of things we can put in place for students to keep them engaged and active, engaged in learning, active learners, and make sure that they don't reach crisis. And there will always be a few students who maybe hit that point, but there's a lot we can do before we get there. So we could drastically reduce restraint. And that's what the data shows too. Data shows that this work can be done and it's been done successfully in other places. And if we think about the neuroscience of learning, it's really impossible to learn if you are experiencing if your brain is in fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? So if you're having a traumatic experience, your prefrontal cortex shuts down and you're not capable of hearing or learning things in that space. So it really does come down to making sure that students feel welcome and safe and have adults that they can trust and have strong relationships and support in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. That's important. So if I could move on to like what are the like the key stakeholders that you sort of partner with in those and like in those particular, situations, stuff like that.
Sure.
Now that we're on the subject.
Yeah, we can dive right in. Well, as you can imagine, this impacts pretty much everyone who works in education. So there are a lot of stakeholders. So we worked all through this last session, very close, this last legislative session in Washington. And there's national legislation on this too. There's federal legislation that would eliminate isolation, but the work that I've been doing has been really focused in Washington State. And so, as you can imagine, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction has been very involved, and uh, they were the ones who submitted the bill this session. So it was an agency request to eliminate isolation and reduce restraint and put these other supports in place. And there we worked closely with legislators. We, of course, the Washington Education Association and other unions were involved. Um, the PTA was supportive, the state PTA, and then many local PTAs and many special education PTAs were also supportive. There were the Special Education Advisory Council at the state level, the Office of the Education Ombudsman, the State Board of Education, the Equity in Education Coalition, the League of Education Voters. I could keep going. I guess there were a lot of groups that were really interested in making this happen. So, and there are a lot of groups who are impacted by this practice because, we all want to see classrooms where students have the supports they need to thrive and learn.
Hmm. Yeah, if I could move on to like and talk about the impact that your work has on the disability community, that would be great.
Yeah. So the part of the part of what's so critical in my mind about this work is that it goes to the heart of the school to prison pipeline. And so the way that the school to prison pipeline works for students with disabilities is, students are criminalized for disability and they can end up in um, juvenile justice or more punitive settings. But also, I think what happens to students with disabilities is they get more and more and more segregated on the basis of disability and disability related behavior, or what the adults in that space decide is disability related behavior, right? And then students end up in more segregated classrooms, more isolated settings. And what we know about segregation is that segregation breeds segregation. So we really are setting these students up for a lifetime of institutionalization and um, supports, like heavily laden support systems, instead of giving them the tools that they need to self-regulate and lead self-determined independent lives.
Hmm. Yeah. What can be done to sort of like change that? Because um you know, like you talk about like how a lot of people with disabilities are often incarcerated or in jails. But so like how can we sort of change that in order to like not go down that road and like because I know like there's a lot of stigma around disability and a lot of ableism or bias against people with disabilities. So like how do we change that in order to really include them in our society?
That is the million-dollar question, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think this work is important, but even so much of it comes down to having strong inclusionary practices for students with disabilities, recognizing that students with disabilities are general education students first and foremost, right? That there's not a place for them to go. there's not a space where they're dealt with more easily, which is kind of what you hear sometimes, right? And we're seeing, for example, there's an increase of students who are being sent for out-of-state residential. Um, and I guess words matter too, right? So the way that we talk about disability, I guess one example I can give you is that when we were doing this work this last session, part of the messaging that we came up against was, these students are dangerous, they're violent, they're explosive, they are doing a lot of harm, they're injuring teachers. All of that language is really cemented in this intersection of racism and ableism in the school to prison pipeline, right? Because if for any student who has experienced a lot of trauma, when they don't have support, yeah, they can escalate quickly and they can have behavior that is reflective of the trauma they are experiencing. But that doesn't mean that they, as individuals, are dangerous or explosive. And I think characterizing people that way does a lot of harm. It creates a lot of stigma for students who are in crisis. So just even changing the way we talk about trauma in school, making sure students have supports, making sure we're addressing equity and bias in our with our teachers and our educators, all of those components come into play.
Yeah, doing the work is important. It's just like saying like your words don't actually cut it. It's actually doing the work that I think can really make a difference. Don't you think?
Yeah, I do. I
Hmm.
agree.
Yeah. Important points.